The morning sun cast long shadows across LaGuardia Airport's private terminal as Sarah Mitchell rushed through the parking lot, her heels clicking against the pavement. At 38 years old, she had grown accustomed to early morning flights, but today felt different. Her dark brown hair was neatly pulled back into a professional bun, and her navy blue Armani suit was crisp and wrinkle-free, despite her having been up since 4 a.m. preparing for her presentation. Sarah checked her watch, 7:45 a.m. She was cutting it close, but she still had 15 minutes before her scheduled departure to Chicago. The weight of her leather briefcase reminded her of the importance of today's meeting. Inside were documents that represented months of work, a proposal that could potentially bring in a $50 million investment deal for her firm. As she approached the private terminal's entrance, Sarah couldn't help but smile. 10 years ago, she would never have imagined being in this position. Growing up in a middle-class family in Detroit, private jets had seemed like something from another world. But through relentless determination, countless late nights, and an unwavering focus on her goals, she had built her investment firm from scratch. Now, at 38, she was the CEO of Mitchell and Associates, managing portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The glass doors of the terminal slid open, welcoming her into the luxurious space. The interior was everything one would expect from a private aviation facility: gleaming marble floors, comfortable leather seating, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a perfect view of the sleek private jets parked outside. The smell of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air, and soft classical music played in the background. Several other passengers were scattered throughout the terminal. A middle-aged white man in a gray suit was talking loudly on his phone about golf scores. Near him, a couple was quietly sipping coffee while their pilot reviewed flight plans with them. Sarah noticed how they all moved through the space with an air of belonging, never questioning their right to be there. As she walked toward the security checkpoint, Sarah mentally reviewed her presentation points. The meeting with Thompson Industries could be a game-changer for her firm. If successful, it would be her largest client acquisition to date. She had spent weeks perfecting every detail, ensuring that each number, each projection, and each strategy was flawless. Her phone buzzed with a message from her assistant, Jessica. "Good luck today, boss. Called ahead to make sure the car will be waiting at Chicago Executive Airport." Sarah smiled at the message. Having a reliable team had been crucial to her success, and Jessica was one of her best hires. The security checkpoint was just ahead, staffed by a guard who appeared to be in his mid-50s. His name tag read Thomas Reynolds, and he stood with the rigid posture of someone who took his job very seriously, perhaps too seriously. As Sarah approached, she noticed his eyes narrow slightly, his posture stiffening even more. She reached for her credentials and booking confirmation, a habit she had developed over years of dealing with people who seemed surprised by her presence in spaces like this. Despite being a regular client at this terminal, experience had taught her to always be prepared for questioning. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the diamond studs in her ears, a gift she had bought herself after closing her first $1 million deal. They sparkled as she walked forward, her stride confident and purposeful. The sound of her heels echoed in the quiet terminal, drawing a few glances from the other passengers. Sarah could feel the weight of the moment as she neared the checkpoint. There was something in Reynolds' expression that she recognized all too well. That look of doubt, of presumption, of judgment before a single word was spoken. She had seen it countless times throughout her career, from the college advisors who suggested she choose an easier major than finance, to the bank managers who hesitated to approve her business loans. But Sarah Mitchell hadn't built her success by letting others' prejudices define her path. She had learned to face such moments with grace and unwavering determination. As she prepared to present her credentials to Reynolds, she maintained her professional composure, her expression neutral but confident. Little did she know that this routine security check was about to become anything but ordinary. The hands on the terminal's large clock moved to 7:50 a.m. In 10 minutes, her flight was scheduled to depart. In the next few moments, an incident would unfold that would not only impact her morning, but would lead to lasting changes in how this private terminal operated. As Sarah approached the security checkpoint, Thomas Reynolds stepped forward with an air of authority that seemed excessive even for a security guard. His weathered face hardened as he held up his hand in a stopping gesture, not even waiting for Sarah to present her credentials. "Ma'am, this is a private terminal," Reynolds said, his voice carrying across the quiet space. The regular passenger terminal is in the main building. He pointed toward the exit, speaking slowly as if explaining something to a child. Sarah had encountered situations like this before, but it never failed to make her heart rate quicken. She maintained her professional demeanor as she reached into her briefcase. "I'm aware this is a private terminal," she replied calmly. "I have my booking confirmation right here." Reynolds barely glanced at the documents she held out. Instead, his eyes traveled from her face to her expensive suit, then to her briefcase, as if trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Behind them, a white businessman walked past, and Reynolds simply nodded him through without checking any documentation. "There must be some mistake," Reynolds insisted, still blocking Sarah's path. "This terminal is for private jet passengers only. These are high-end clients who regularly—" He trailed off, the implication hanging heavily in the air. Sarah took a deep breath, remembering all the similar moments in her career when she had to prove herself worthy of occupying spaces others thought she didn't belong in. "I am a regular client," she stated firmly. "I've flown from this terminal 6 times in the past month alone. My jet is scheduled to depart for Chicago in less than 10 minutes. The guard's face reddened slightly, but he stood his ground. "Anyone can print out documents," he said dismissively. "I've worked here for 15 years, and I know our regular clients." His emphasis on the word regular made it clear what he meant. By now, other passengers had begun to notice the confrontation. Some pretended not to see, suddenly very interested in their phones or newspapers. Others watched openly, a few with uncomfortable expressions as they recognized the situation unfolding before them. Sarah pulled out her phone and opened her flight booking app, which showed her entire history of private flights. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, her voice steady but firm, "I am the CEO of Mitchell and Associates. We manage over $500 million in investments, and I have an important meeting in Chicago that I cannot be late for. I've flown from this terminal dozens of times." Reynolds crossed his arms, his badge glinting under the terminal's lights. "Look," he said, lowering his voice but maintaining his confrontational tone, "even if you work for some company, that doesn't mean you're authorized to be here. Some people just don't understand that this is a very exclusive facility." The situation was becoming increasingly tense. Sarah could feel her precious minutes ticking away. Her meeting in Chicago could determine the future direction of her firm, and here she was, being blocked because of one man's prejudiced assumptions. Just then, a young white couple approached the checkpoint. Without hesitation, Reynolds stepped aside to let them pass, checking their documents with a friendly smile. "Have a wonderful flight, Mr. and Mrs. Davidson," he said warmly. Sarah felt her patience wearing thin, but years of navigating similar situations had taught her to remain composed. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, her voice clear and authoritative, "I need to speak with your supervisor immediately." "My supervisor?" Reynolds scoffed. "Listen, I'm trying to be nice here, but if you don't leave, I'll have to call security." The irony of a security guard threatening to call security seemed lost on him. Sarah pulled out her business card, embossed with her company's logo and her title as CEO, and placed it on the counter. Next to it, she laid her pilot's authorization card, her frequent flyer platinum status card, and her terminal access card. "Call your supervisor," she repeated, her tone leaving no room for argument. "And while you're at it, you might want to check who exactly owns the majority shares in this private aviation company." Reynolds' expression flickered with the first hint of uncertainty. Around them, more passengers had stopped to watch the scene unfold. The terminal's atmosphere had grown thick with tension, and the morning sun streaming through the windows seemed to spotlight this moment of confrontation between prejudice and power. The clock on the wall showed 7:55 a.m. Sarah's flight was scheduled to leave in 5 minutes, but this situation was far from over. In fact, it was about to take a turn that neither Reynolds nor anyone else in the terminal could have anticipated. The tension in the terminal grew thicker as Sarah and Reynolds remained locked in their standoff. Other passengers had stopped pretending not to notice, and a small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance. The morning sun continued to stream through the large windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Reynolds picked up Sarah's business card, squinting at it with obvious skepticism. His fingers drummed nervously on the security counter as he reached for his radio, never taking his eyes off Sarah. "Control, this is checkpoint 3. I need a supervisor here immediately." His voice wavered slightly, betraying the first signs of uncertainty. While they waited, another passenger, a white man in his 60s, approached the checkpoint. Reynolds immediately straightened up, starting to wave him through, but Sarah spoke up. "Excuse me," she said firmly. "I believe I was here first, and we haven't resolved my situation." Her voice carried across the terminal, causing several heads to turn. The older man looked between Sarah and Reynolds, then checked his watch. "Actually," he said, surprising everyone, "I know Sarah Mitchell. She's handling my company's pension fund investments." He turned to Reynolds with a frown. "Is there a problem here?" Reynolds' face flushed red. "Sir, I'm just following protocol," he began, but the man cut him off. "Protocol?" The older man raised an eyebrow. "I've been flying from this terminal for 20 years, and I've never seen anyone treated this way. Ms. Mitchell's firm manages billions in assets. She's more qualified to be here than most of us." More murmurs rippled through the growing crowd. Sarah maintained her composed demeanor, though inside she felt a complex mix of emotions: gratitude for the support, frustration at needing it, and determination to turn this situation into something meaningful. The clock now showed 8:00 a.m. Her flight was supposed to be departing, and Sarah could see her pilot through the window, standing by the jet, checking his watch with concern. She pulled out her phone and quickly texted her assistant. "Delay at security. Call Thompson Industries. May need to push meeting 30 minutes." Just then, the terminal manager, Patricia Wong, hurried toward the checkpoint. She was a sharp-dressed woman in her 40s who took one look at the scene and immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. "Ms. Mitchell," she said, her face showing genuine concern, "I just got word of what's happening. I am so terribly sorry for this incident." Reynolds started to speak, but Patricia held up her hand, silencing him. "Mr. Reynolds, do you realize who Ms. Mitchell is? She's not just a client. She's part of the ownership group that acquired majority shares in our aviation company last month." The color drained from Reynolds' face. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. The radio in his hand slipped and clattered onto the counter. Sarah stepped forward, her voice clear and controlled. "Ms. Wong, I appreciate your quick response. However, this isn't just about me or my position. This is about a systemic issue that needs addressing." She gestured to the other passengers watching. "How many other qualified professionals have been treated this way because they didn't fit someone's preconception of what a private jet owner looks like?" Patricia nodded gravely. "You're absolutely right, Ms. Mitchell. This is unacceptable, and we need immediate changes." She turned to Reynolds, who was now visibly sweating. "Mr. Reynolds, please report to HR immediately after your shift." But Sarah raised her hand. "Actually," she said, surprising everyone again, "I have a different suggestion. Instead of punishment, what we need is education." She looked directly at Reynolds, who couldn't meet her gaze. "I'd like to schedule a meeting with your HR department. I believe we can turn this unfortunate incident into an opportunity for positive change." The terminal had grown completely quiet. Even those pretending to be busy on their phones were now openly watching. Sarah's pilot had come inside and was waiting respectfully at the edge of the crowd. Patricia looked at Sarah with admiration. "Of course, whatever you think is best, Ms. Mitchell. Shall we escort you to your flight now? I believe we've delayed you long enough." As Sarah finally moved past the security checkpoint, the other passengers began to applaud spontaneously. Reynolds stood frozen, his entire worldview visibly shaken. The morning sun had risen higher now, and as Sarah walked toward her waving jet, her shadow stretched long behind her, like a symbol of the impact this morning would have on everyone who had witnessed it. This incident was far from over, but it was about to transform from a moment of discrimination into an opportunity for lasting change. The meeting room on the terminal's second floor was silent except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning. 2 hours had passed since the incident at the security checkpoint, and now Sarah sat at the head of a polished conference table, surrounded by the aviation company's senior management team. Sarah had made it to Chicago, though delayed. Her client, understanding the situation after a brief explanation, had eagerly rescheduled their meeting for the following day. Now she was back at LaGuardia, ready to address the morning's events head-on. Terminal manager Patricia Wong sat to her right, along with James Harrison, the company's CEO, who had flown in specifically for this meeting after hearing about the incident. Thomas Reynolds sat at the far end of the table, looking significantly smaller than he had earlier that morning. His security uniform seemed to weigh heavily on his shoulders, and his earlier arrogance had been replaced by obvious discomfort. "Let me be clear," James Harrison began, his voice firm but measured. "What happened this morning is completely unacceptable. Mr. Reynolds, we're prepared to terminate your employment immediately." He turned to Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell, we can't apologize enough for what you experienced." Sarah leaned forward in her chair, her hands clasped on the table. "Before we make any decisions," she said, "I'd like to share something." She looked directly at Reynolds, who finally met her gaze. 10 years ago, when I was starting my firm, I walked into a major bank seeking a business loan. The manager there treated me exactly like Mr. Reynolds did today, with dismissal, disbelief, and prejudice. The room remained silent as she continued. That bank manager was later forced to retire, but nothing really changed. The next person who sat in his chair carried the same biases, just perhaps hidden a bit better. She paused, allowing her words to sink in. "I don't want that to happen here." Harrison looked confused. "What are you suggesting, Miss Mitchell?" Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the private jets on the tarmac. "I'm suggesting we use this moment to create real change." She turned back to face the room. "I want to help develop a comprehensive training program. Not just basic diversity training, but real, meaningful education about unconscious bias and its impact on business." Reynolds, who had been silent until now, spoke up hesitantly. "Why? Why would you do that?" His voice cracked slightly. "After how I treated you." Sarah smiled slightly. "Because firing you doesn't solve the real problem, Mr. Reynolds. It doesn't help the next person who might face similar treatment, here or anywhere else." She returned to her seat. "But turning this incident into an opportunity for education and growth, that could make a real difference." Patricia Wong was already taking notes. "What exactly are you proposing, Ms. Mitchell?" "A 3-month program," Sarah replied. "I'll work with your HR team to develop it. We'll cover everything from cultural competency to modern business etiquette. Mr. Reynolds," she looked at him again, "would be our first participant. And if he successfully completes the program, not only will he keep his job, but he'll become part of the training team for future sessions." Reynolds' eyes widened in surprise. The other executives exchanged glances, clearly impressed by this unexpected approach. Harrison nodded slowly. "Ms. Mitchell, your grace in handling this situation is remarkable. We would be grateful for your help in developing this program." "There's one more thing," Sarah added. "I want this terminal to actively recruit more diverse staff at all levels. Show people that private aviation isn't an exclusive club based on appearance or background, but a service open to all who work hard enough to achieve their goals." For the first time since the morning's incident, Reynolds sat up straighter. I would like to be part of that change," he said quietly. "What I did this morning. I've never had to face my own prejudices so directly before. I want to do better." Sarah nodded acknowledgement. As the meeting continued, plans were made and commitments were secured. Outside, the afternoon sun painted the sky in brilliant colors, a fitting backdrop to a day that had started with discrimination but was ending with promise. The incident that could have ended a career was instead becoming the catalyst for meaningful change. As Sarah looked around the room, she saw something she hadn't expected to find: hope and the genuine desire for transformation. 3 weeks after the incident, the private terminal at LaGuardia Airport buzzed with a different kind of energy. The first session of the new diversity training program was about to begin, and Sarah Mitchell stood at the front of a converted conference room, watching as security staff, terminal employees, and even some pilots filed in. Thomas Reynolds sat in the front row, his notebook open and pen ready. The past 3 weeks had changed him visibly. His posture was different, more humble yet somehow more dignified. He had spent this time helping Sarah and the HR team understand the day-to-day operations of the terminal, offering insights that would make the training program more practical and relevant. "Good morning, everyone," Sarah began, her voice carrying the same confidence she used in business presentations. 3 weeks ago, right here in this terminal, something happened that could have ended very differently." She glanced at Reynolds, who nodded slightly, giving her permission to continue. Sarah walked to the center of the room. "Mr. Reynolds and I could have become just another story of confrontation and dismissal. Instead, We're here to start something new. She clicked a button, and behind her, a screen lit up with the words, Aviation is for everyone. Building an inclusive future. The room was packed with 50 employees, representing every department of the terminal. Patricia Wong sat near the back, taking notes, while James Harrison observed from the doorway. The company had fully embraced Sarah's vision, investing significant resources into making this program a success. But before we begin, Sarah continued, I'd like to invite Mr. Reynolds to share something with you all. She stepped aside, gesturing for him to come forward. Reynolds stood slowly, facing his colleagues. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his uniform tie. 3 weeks ago, he began, his voice initially shaky but growing stronger. I made a terrible mistake. I let my prejudices, my assumptions, and my ignorance guide my actions. He paused, taking a deep breath. I've worked here for 15 years, and I thought I knew everything about our clients. But that morning showed me how wrong I was. How my biases weren't just hurting others. They were making me a worse person, a worse employee, and a worse member of this community. The room was silent, every person focused on Reynolds' words. Some nodded in understanding, perhaps recognizing similar thoughts they'd had themselves. Ms. Mitchell could have demanded my firing, Reynolds continued. Instead, she showed me something I'd never experienced in all my years of dealing with angry customers. Empathy and a desire for real change. His voice cracked slightly. She saw past my mistake to the possibility of transformation, not just for me, but for our entire operation. Sarah stepped forward again. This program isn't about pointing fingers or making people feel guilty, she explained. It's about opening our eyes to the unconscious biases we all carry and learning how to move past them. The screen behind her changed to show statistics about diversity in private aviation. Did you know, she asked, that less than 1% of private jet owners are people of color? But that number is changing. The face of success is changing, and we need to be ready to welcome that change. For the next hour, Sarah and Reynolds led the group through exercises designed to challenge their assumptions. They discussed real scenarios, shared personal experiences, and began the hard work of examining their own biases. During a break, Patricia Wong approached Sarah. The change in Reynolds is remarkable, she observed. He's been helping other employees understand the importance of this training, even before it began. Sarah nodded, watching Reynolds engage with a group of younger security officers, explaining something with animated gestures. Sometimes, she said, people just need to be given the chance to learn and grow. As the session resumed, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. The incident that had started with discrimination was transforming into something powerful and positive. She looked at her watch. In 2 hours, she had another flight to catch from this very terminal. But this time would be different. This time, she knew that every person in this room would carry a new understanding back to their posts. The changes they were making today would ripple out, affecting countless future passengers who would walk through these doors. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the room filled with people eager to learn and change. It was just the beginning, but it was a beginning full of promise. 2 months into the training program, the private terminal had undergone a visible transformation. New faces appeared among the staff, representing a diversity that had been lacking before. Thomas Reynolds, once the face of prejudice, had become an unexpected champion of change. On this particular morning, Sarah arrived for her regular flight to Boston and found Reynolds at his usual post. But instead of standing alone, he was training a new security officer, a young black woman named Maya Thompson. Ms. Mitchell, Reynolds called out warmly as she approached. Please meet our newest team member. Maya, this is Sarah Mitchell, the person who helped transform our entire operation. Maya's eyes lit up with recognition. Ms. Mitchell, we learned about your story in our orientation. You're the reason I felt confident applying for this position. Sarah smiled, remembering her own journey. As she moved through security, she noticed other changes too. The terminal's walls now displayed photographs of diverse aviation pioneers. A new sign near the entrance read, Welcome to your sky, where every dream takes flight. Later that afternoon, Sarah sat in the terminal's management office with Patricia Wong, reviewing the program's progress. Spread across the desk were reports showing significant improvements in customer satisfaction and staff morale. The numbers are impressive, Patricia said, sliding a document toward Sarah. Complaints about discriminatory treatment have dropped to zero in the past month, and applications for positions here have increased by 300%, particularly from minority candidates. Sarah nodded, but her attention was drawn to something else, a letter on Patricia's desk. "What's this?" she asked. Patricia smiled. "That's actually why I wanted to meet today. It's from Thomas Reynolds. He's asked to speak at the National Aviation Security Conference about our program. They want to implement similar training in other private terminals across the country." Sarah picked up the letter, reading Reynolds' words. His writing was passionate, describing how the past 2 months had changed not just his professional life, but his personal perspectives as well. He wrote about accompanying his grandson to a career day at school, where he had proudly told young children of all backgrounds that they could aspire to any role in aviation. "He's become quite the advocate," Patricia continued. "Last week, he organized a tour for students from inner-city schools, showed them the jets, introduced them to pilots, talked about careers in aviation. These kids' faces just lit up. Many had never even been to an airport before." The door opened, and Reynolds himself entered, carrying a thick binder. "Oh, excuse me," he said, starting to back out, but Sarah waved him in. "We were just talking about your conference speaking request," Sarah said. "I think it's an excellent idea." Reynolds placed the binder on the desk. "This is my presentation draft. I've been working on it every evening." He opened it, revealing meticulously organized pages. "I want to show other airports that change is possible, that it's necessary, and that it makes business sense too." Sarah flipped through the pages, noting how Reynolds had documented everything, from the initial incident to the training processes, from staff feedback to customer responses. He had even included before and after photos of the terminal, showing the subtle but significant changes in signage, artwork, and staff diversity. "You've become quite the champion for inclusion," Sarah observed. Reynolds straightened his uniform badge, which now included a small pin indicating his role as a diversity trainer. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "my grandkids asked me last week what I do for a living. For the first time in my career, I felt proud telling them the whole truth, that I help make sure everyone feels welcome in our skies." Patricia checked her watch. "The next training session starts in 10 minutes. We have representatives from 3 other private terminals observing today." As they walked toward the training room, they passed the spot where, just 2 months ago, prejudice had tried to block Sarah's path. Now, that same spot was marked by a small plaque. "Every journey begins with welcome steps." The afternoon sun streamed through the terminal's windows, casting long shadows behind them. But unlike the shadows of that fateful morning, these shadows seemed to point forward, toward a future where the skies truly belonged to everyone. Reynolds held the door open as Sarah and Patricia entered the training room. Inside, a new group of aviation professionals waited to learn how one morning's confrontation had sparked a movement of change that was spreading across the industry, one terminal at a time. 1 year after the incident, Sarah Mitchell stood at the podium of the National Aviation Industry Conference in Dallas. The grand ballroom was filled with over 500 aviation professionals from across the country. In the front row sat Thomas Reynolds, now dressed in a sharp business suit rather than his security uniform. "When I walked into LaGuardia's private terminal that morning," Sarah began, her voice carrying through the hushed room, "I had no idea I was about to become part of a story that would change the face of private aviation." She gestured to Reynolds. "And I'm sure Mr. Reynolds here didn't expect that his actions that day would lead him to where he is now." The audience listened intently as Sarah described how what could have been just another story of discrimination had instead become a catalyst for industry-wide change. Behind her, slides showed the impressive results. 25 private terminals across the country had adopted their training program, employee diversity had increased by 200%, and customer satisfaction rates had reached all-time highs. Reynolds stood up next, adjusting his tie as he took the podium. Gone was the defensive, prejudiced security guard of a year ago. In his place stood a confident speaker who had become one of the industry's leading voices for inclusion. "Last month," Reynolds shared, his voice steady and clear, "a young girl visited our terminal with her school group. She pointed at our wall of aviation pioneers, which now includes faces of all colors and backgrounds, and said, 'Look, Mom, they look like me.' That moment hit me hard. I realized that the changes we've made aren't just about policies and procedures. They're about showing the next generation that the sky truly is for everyone. The conference room erupted in applause. In the audience, several terminal managers were already taking notes, eager to implement similar changes at their facilities. After the presentation, Sarah and Reynolds found themselves surrounded by aviation executives, all wanting to know more about their program. One older gentleman, the owner of a chain of private terminals in Texas, shook Reynolds' hand vigorously. "I've been in this business 40 years, he said, and I've never seen anything like this. You've not just changed policies, you've changed hearts and minds." Later that evening, at the conference dinner, Sarah and Reynolds sat at a table with Patricia Wong and several other industry leaders. The conversation flowed easily as they discussed the future of aviation and the importance of inclusive practices. "You know what surprised me most?" Reynolds said, cutting into his dinner. "How many other security officers reached out to thank me. They said my story helped them recognize their own biases. Some even admitted they'd done similar things but never had the courage to acknowledge it." Sarah nodded, remembering the countless emails and messages they'd received over the past year. Change often starts with one person willing to admit they were wrong and commit to doing better. Patricia added, "The ripple effects have been amazing. Last week, we hired our first female head of security at LaGuardia's private terminal. She was inspired to apply after hearing about our program." As the evening wore on, Sarah noticed Reynolds pulling out his phone to show photos to some of the other guests. They were pictures from the terminal's latest community outreach event, a career day that had brought hundreds of underprivileged kids to learn about aviation careers. Next month, Reynolds announced proudly, "We're launching a scholarship program. 2 students from that career day will receive full funding for flight school." Sarah smiled, remembering her own journey and the obstacles she'd faced. The incident that had started with discrimination had grown into something far bigger than she'd ever imagined. It wasn't just about making private aviation more inclusive, it was about changing the entire industry's culture. As the conference's final day drew to a close, Sarah and Reynolds stood at the airport, preparing to board their flights home. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant colors, a fitting backdrop to their achievements. "You know," Reynolds said thoughtfully, "watching planes take off and land, a year ago, I thought I was protecting something by keeping people out. Now I realize that the real protection comes from letting everyone in, from making sure everyone has a chance to reach for the sky." Sarah nodded, looking up at the same sky. What had begun as a confrontation at a security checkpoint had become a movement, changing not just one terminal or one company, but an entire industry's approach to inclusion and equality. 5 years had passed since that fateful morning at LaGuardia's private terminal. Sarah Mitchell stood at the window of her new office, looking down at the bustling aviation complex below. The building, freshly constructed, housed the headquarters of the Aviation Inclusion Initiative, AI, an organization that had grown from a single terminal's training program into a nationwide movement. Thomas Reynolds, now the executive director of training at AI, knocked on her door. "The new class is ready for you, Sarah," he said, his gray hair and kind eyes reflecting the wisdom gained over these transformative years. Together, they walked to the training center, where 30 eager faces awaited them. These weren't just security staff anymore. They were terminal managers, airline executives, and aviation business owners from across the globe, all here to learn how to make their organizations more inclusive. 5 years ago, Sarah began, addressing the room. A moment of discrimination could have ended very differently. Instead, it sparked a revolution in private aviation. She gestured to Reynolds, who now stood with the confidence of a man who had found his true calling. The room's walls told their story through photographs and headlines. "Private aviation industry transforms read one. From prejudice to progress. How one incident changed an industry," declared another. But the most powerful display was the wall of success stories. Photographs of diverse professionals who had found their place in aviation through AI's programs. Reynolds stepped forward to share his part of the story. "I was that security guard," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "I was the obstacle, the face of discrimination, but thanks to Ms. Mitchell's vision, I became part of the solution." He clicked through slides showing the initiative's impact. Over 200 private terminals had implemented their training program, diversity in aviation management had increased by 400%, and their scholarship program had sent more than 500 students to flight school. Maya Thompson, the security officer Reynolds had trained years ago, now walked in. She wore the uniform of a commercial airline captain, having achieved her dream through one of AI's first scholarship programs. "I'm here to share some news," she announced, beaming. "United Airlines has just pledged $10 million to expand our flight training programs to every major city in the country." The room erupted in applause. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes as she remembered how far they'd come. That morning at the security checkpoint seemed like a lifetime ago, yet its impact continued to grow. After the session, Sarah, Reynolds, and Maya sat in the office lounge, sharing coffee and memories. "Remember when we thought success would be just changing one terminal?" Reynolds chuckled, shaking his head in amazement. "Now we're changing the entire industry," Maya added. "Last week, I flew a plane full of young girls on their first aviation experience tour. Their eyes lit up when they saw me in the cockpit. One little girl said, 'Look, Mom, the pilot looks like me.'" Sarah smiled, remembering Reynolds telling a similar story years ago. That's what this was always about, showing people that they belong, that the sky is for everyone. The sun was setting outside, casting a golden glow across the aviation complex. Below, they could see a group of students touring the facility, their excited chatter carrying up to the window. They were part of AI's newest program, a summer aviation camp for underprivileged youth. "Next month marks 5 years since that morning," Reynolds said thoughtfully. "How should we commemorate it?" Sarah walked to her desk and pulled out a framed photograph. It showed her and Reynolds at the security checkpoint, taken the day they launched their first training program. "By remembering that change is always possible," she said, "and that sometimes the biggest obstacles can become the strongest allies." As they prepared to leave for the day, a young security officer stopped them in the lobby. "Mr. Reynolds, Ms. Mitchell," she said excitedly, "I just wanted to thank you. I read about your story in my training manual. It's why I believed I could work in aviation." Reynolds smiled warmly, remembering his own journey. "The sky belongs to everyone," he said, repeating the phrase that had become AI's motto. "We just have to be brave enough to open the door." As they stepped outside into the evening air, aircraft lights twinkled above them like stars. The story that began with discrimination had transformed into a legacy of inclusion, proving that sometimes the greatest changes come from the most challenging moments. The sky above them was no longer a barrier but a promise that anyone, regardless of who they were, could find their place among the clouds.